forum that we have staged today. I am Ray Paprocki, a proud member of the CMC Board of Trustees, and side gig as publisher of the Dispatch magazines. It's great to see everyone today.
So, for today's forum, entitled The Bellwether, Why Ohio Picks the President, is brought to us with support from Hannah News Service and the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, each represented by many of their friends and associates today. So won't you please help me by thanking them. All right, as we know, Ohio is the center of attention during the presidential election cycles. If the commercials already running during nightly news are a fair indication, 2016 will be no exception. We are subjected to this costly blitz of televised rhetoric and a regular schedule of in-person visits for a simple reason. As our guest speaker has noted, Ohio picks the president. To find out why, let's welcome our speaker. That would be author, columnist, and pundit who analyzes elections at the University of Virginia Center for Politics, Kyle Kondik, and State House News Bureau Chief Karen Kassler is with us. Kyle will make opening remarks and then join Karen at the table for conversation. Kyle?
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the Columbus Metropolitan Club for having me today. And thank you to you all for coming. We've got family and friends here and many others. There's one person I particularly want to thank, and that is my old professor and mentor at Ohio University, Tom Suddes, who's here. I would not have been able to do this book without Tom's help, and Tom has forgotten more about Ohio politics than I may ever know, so I just want to salute Tom for helping me with the book. And I believe Tom will be on this stage on August 24th with Jerry Springer, of all people. So mark your calendars for that one. So we're here in Columbus today, and John F. Kennedy had a great quote about Columbus. He said, quote, "There is no city in the United States in which I get a warmer welcome and fewer votes than Columbus, Ohio." For many decades, Columbus was a Republican town, but like so many other big growing urban counties across the country, has become Democratic over time to the point where it's more Democratic now than it has ever been since the Civil War. There are all sorts of shifts that have happened within Ohio over the past 30 elections, shifts that I examine in detail in my book, The Bellwether, Why Ohio Picks the President. Just to point out a few of these besides the changes in Columbus, in 1896, the election where I start my study, where Republican William McKinley from Ohio won the presidency and won Ohio. He carried 9 of the state's 10 most populous counties in 1896. In 2012, Barack Obama carried 9 of the 10 most populous counties. In 1896, McKinley's opponent, William Jennings Bryan, his best 2 counties in Ohio were 2 rural counties, Holmes County, which is Amish country, and Mercer County, which is a heavily Catholic county in northwest Ohio. In 2012, Mitt Romney's 2 best counties in Ohio were Mercer and Holmes. So the state has changed quite a bit in this 30-year period I looked at, and yet throughout that whole 30 election cycle, the state continually voted very close to the national average. The changes that happened within it largely canceled themselves out. Kennedy would lose Ohio in 1960, partially because he didn't get as many votes out of Columbus as he hoped for. But he did win the election nationally. He's the last president to win a presidential election without carrying Ohio. The state has voted for the winner in every election since 1964, which is the longest streak in the nation. It has also more broadly voted for the winner in 28 of 30 elections, which is the best record of picking presidents of any state in that time frame. And then on average, it has deviated only about 2 points from the national average in each election, which again is the best of any state. There are a number of reasons for this, and let me offer 3 quickly. First of all is that Ohio is and always has been reflective of the nation. While Ohio was the 17th state admitted to the Union, it was in some ways the first state that was, quote, typically American, as the Great Depression era Ohio Guide described it. From its founding, Ohio featured the characteristics and habits of the nation as a whole. The Western Reserve, which is northeast Ohio, Cuyahoga County and Cleveland, where I'm from, it was once part of Connecticut, and when it was settled, it was largely settled by people from Connecticut and other northeastern states. And actually, northeast Ohio today still votes a lot like Connecticut does. A big part of central and southwestern Ohio was reserved for Virginia military veterans of the Revolutionary War. This is called the Virginia Military District, and it was largely settled by Southerners. The middle of the state was largely settled by people from Pennsylvania and other parts of the Middle Atlantic. The historians Kevin Kern and Gregory Wilson write in Ohio, A History of the Buckeye State, that more than any other state, Ohio's population became a microcosm of the whole country due to migration patterns in the early statehood period. And I would argue that it has largely stayed that way as a microcosm ever since then. The second reason is that Ohio does not have a dominant region. While Ohio, of course, has many major cities, none of those cities actually dominate its voting. Even if you combined Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, Franklin County, Columbus, and Hamilton County, Cincinnati, they only cast about 30% of the state's total votes combined. If you put those three counties together, Barack Obama won them with about 60% of the vote in 2012. Let's compare that to Illinois, where Cook County, which is Chicago, casts 40%, just that one county casts 40% of all the votes in that state, and Obama got about 75% of the vote in that county. So if you would remove Chicago from Illinois, and if you take our three big cities out of Ohio, the states would vote almost exactly the same. They both would have supported Romney by about 5 points. But the difference is that Cook County and Chicago is this dominant force in Illinois, and our three cities are not as Democratic combined, and none of those cities have ever dominated the statewide voting. The state is a competitive mix of urban, suburban, and rural, really just like the country is as a whole. And finally, Ohio does not have a dominant industry that really influences its politics more than other industries do. And so I just want to list in order, these are Ohio's Fortune 500 companies. Kroger, Marathon Petroleum, Cardinal Health, Procter & Gamble, Nationwide, Macy's, Progressive, Goodyear Tire, American Electric Power, First Energy, Parker Hannifin, L Brands, Sherwin-Williams, Travel Centers of America, Owens, Illinois, Dana Holding, Omnicare, AK Steel Holding, Fifth Third Bank, American Financial Group, Smuckers, Western Southern Financial Group, and Owens Corning. What do those companies have in common? I would say not much. Unlike many other states, like, say, West Virginia, which has a strong identification with the coal industry, or maybe a state like Iowa and Nebraska that has a strong identification with agriculture, even though people on the coast may think we're just a giant farm here in Ohio, I would not say that we have a dominant industry that really impacts how the state votes. And so you could kind of combine those three factors, and I think my argument is essentially that in presidential elections, Ohio is special precisely because it's not special. For its whole history, the state has been a melting pot for the nation demographically and economically. If history is any guide, we would expect Ohio to vote for the winning candidate this year. My day job, I work for the University of Virginia Center for Politics. We are officially nonpartisan. We do not root for one candidate or one party over the other. I will admit that I have a rooting interest in this election, and that is I don't want my book to be immediately obsolete, so I hope Ohio votes for the winner. And with that, I'm going to move over here and we'll do the Q&A.
All right. While Kyle is getting situated here, I want to remind you all, I have some questions for him, but if you have any questions for him, you'll have your opportunity to once I ask him a couple here. So are you ready to talk?
Absolutely.
All right, so you ended the speech here by saying perhaps what's special about Ohio is that it's not special at all, which I don't think people here like to hear that. But I think the kind of thing that Ohioans often hear, though, is that we're a test market. And that speaks to the same kind of thing, that Ohio is very similar to the nation in terms of how we vote, in our tastes, in our demographics, in a way.
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, Columbus is actually one of the great product test markets in the whole country. And so, maybe disgusting fast food products that you might hear about, like this new thing at Burger King where they have like a macaroni and cheese and a Cheeto. I wonder if that was debuted in Columbus, Ohio. But there's a long-standing history there. And I think that, you come to Ohio and again, you get agriculture, you get some mining, you get heavy industry, maybe not as much heavy industry as we used to have, but still a lot of it. up in Cleveland, you have the Cleveland Clinic that, is entire city blocks, big chunks of the east side is just hospitals and things like that. And we also have a lot of big public universities, and actually a lot of counties that have big public universities have sort of trended Democratic over time. I think that kind of helps explain the Franklin County story. Again, it was very Republican until 1996 it voted for Clinton, and then it sort of got more Democratic over time. And all those factors kind of commingle. And so, I would say Ohio sort of has everything, but it doesn't have too much of anything. And I think that sort of helps keep it pretty moored to the country in terms of its election results.
Now we hear these two terms from people like me all election year long, bellwether and swing state. And these two are considered interchangeable by some people, but they're actually not. And I want you to explain real briefly what is the difference. Though they do both apply to Ohio, they're not the same thing.
So yeah, you'll hear stories about, there's swing states, there's bellwether states, et cetera. And to me, there's a little subtle difference between the two that I kind of came up with for the book, and that is that Ohio is a bellwether state in that it typically reflects the national voting. And so, if Donald Trump were to win 60-40, you'd expect Ohio to go about 60-40 for him, or 51-49. So a swing state is one that's just close in a given election. So, if one candidate wins by 20 points, then the swing state might be, if a Republican is winning big, the swing state might be California, which is typically Democratic. But there's a thing it's a phenomenon called a uniform swing in elections, meaning that, if someone is winning by 20 points, the whole country is probably going to move by 20 points, roughly speaking. So in a close election, a swing state and a bellwether, same thing, because they're going to vote close to the nation. But in a blowout election, the bellwether might be different from what you'd call a swing state, a state that's actually close in that election.
So they're the same thing for Ohio, but not necessarily the same thing.
Correct.
Yeah. All right, so most states are uncompetitive in tight elections. Why has Ohio kept its importance even as our population has fallen and we've lost electoral votes and we will likely lose electoral votes in the next census? Why are we still this key swing state and this bellwether when other states are not?
So it's really interesting that in the 1960 election, which I referenced, which was very close nationally, there were 20 states decided by 5 points or less out of the 50 states back then. In 1976, a very close election between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, you also had 20 states decided by 5 points or less. In this election, in 2012, you had 4. It was Ohio, of course, Florida, Virginia, North Carolina. And so I would argue that Ohio has always been this fairly steady bellwether state of political opinion, but I think it matters more now because there are so few states that are like that. There were more states back, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that voted close to the national average, and then there just aren't anymore. And a lot of it is that people are becoming kind of sorted out. They, like-minded people live together, and so there's always been an urban-rural split in American politics, but I would argue that it's more pronounced now than it used to be. So you have places like California and New York trended toward the Democrats. You have places like Texas trended toward the Republicans. But we've seen, again, as I noted, a lot of changes in Ohio over the 30 election cycle that I looked at. But they all tended to kind of cancel each other out. When Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton won Ohio in 1976 and then in 92 and 96, Clinton and Carter did really well in Appalachian Ohio, and it kind of makes sense. They were both Southerners. They presented themselves as moderates, but they didn't do so well. They didn't win. Clinton just barely won Franklin County in '96, and Cincinnati did not vote for either of them. But Southeast Ohio, for a lot of reasons, I think because it's culturally conservative, it started to trend Republican, but as Southeast Ohio trended Republican, Franklin and Hamilton trended Democratic, and we've seen that throughout Ohio's history that, those changes will make up for one another in keeping the state as a whole pretty solidly in the middle of the country.
Now, when you go through this 30 election cycle that you go through in the book, 1896 until the last one, you say that Ohio has become a better bellwether over time, more closely matching the national vote. But recent census data shows that Ohio is almost 83% white, but the nation is 77% white. Blacks are 12.7% in Ohio, 13.3% in the nation. Hispanics, this is where the real difference is for Ohio, 3.6% in Ohio, 17.6% across the country. So as the nation's demographics change and Ohio's is different, how will Ohio continue to be a good bellwether?
I think if Ohio were not to be a bellwether in the future, it would be precisely for that reason that its population is whiter than the nation. However, whites in the North don't vote the same way as white voters in the South. White voters in Ohio are actually slightly more Democratic than they are in the national average. And so if that holds up, then I think Ohio can continue to be this bellwether state. But if the Midwest, particularly whites in the Midwest, start trending toward the Republicans, then you could really see, I think, Ohio become sort of more of a solidly Republican state over time. And certainly we've seen that in state politics. When John Kasich leaves office, that will mark it 24 of 28 years the Republicans have held the governor's office in Ohio. But of course, those elections are contested in midterm years, where turnout is typically only about 40%. Where in presidential elections, about 60%. So Democrats don't really come out to vote in force in midterms, but in Ohio, they do show up for presidential elections, particularly recently. And it's enough that a Democrat can carry the state, as Obama did twice.
I think you just stole my next question, which was, how come Ohio is a purple state in presidential elections, but not a purple state in off-year elections?
I think it's a turnout thing, and also, midterm elections, and this is true for House races, Senate races, even governor's races, state legislative. The midterm election is often a backlash against the president's party, and so it's not surprising that Republicans had good years in Ohio in 2010 and 2014 because Democrats did poorly across the country. But look at 2006. We had a very unpopular George W. Bush in the White House, and Democrats won all but one of the statewide offices in Ohio, and took control of the Ohio State House in 2008. But so that midterm dynamic worked in Democrats' favor in 2006. So. In these midterm elections, I think these elections are increasingly getting nationalized to the point where, if you're a Democrat running when there's a Democrat in the White House in Ohio, you might have some trouble, and it may have nothing to do with the campaign you run. It might just have to do with the fact that the national winds are not really blowing your way.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. There was a Quinnipiac poll that came out today that shows, as it did in June, that Clinton and Trump are tied in Ohio. And let's talk a little bit about, first of all, do you think that that does not mirror national polls. National polls show that Clinton is leading Trump by about 5 points. So who's right?
So there often is this disconnect between these national polls and the state polls. And again, with a state like Ohio, you'd expect them to be the same. And actually in 2012, the state polls in Ohio were really pretty accurate. Almost every one of them showed Obama up by 3 or 4 points, and that's what he won by. Where the national polls were tied often, even right up to Election Day. So the state polls were a better measurement that time. But this time it's kind of the reverse. The national polls show Clinton up 4 or 5 points. The Real Clear Politics average of Ohio, as of this morning, was 2.5 points, 2.5 point Clinton lead. That would make some sense. If Clinton is up 4 or 5 points nationally, maybe she's up 2 to 3 points in Ohio. That to me is a little bit more reasonable than tied. But we're really sort of splitting hairs there too. I mean, in a public opinion poll, the difference between a tie and a 2-point lead is not all that dramatic. Supposedly there's a new poll coming out from Marist and NBC News tonight of Ohio that I'll be curious to see if it shows the same thing as Quinnipiac, which has generally been I feel a little bit more pro-Republican this cycle than other polls. In fact, one Quinnipiac poll I always cite is in about this time in 2010, they had John Kasich up 20 points in the governor's race. And I don't think anyone believed it, and of course Kasich ended up winning by 2. So polls at this point are not predictive necessarily.
But one thing that's interesting in the Quinnipiac poll, too, is when you throw in the minor party candidates, you've got Jill Stein on the Green Party ticket, and then Gary Johnson, who is a libertarian but will run in Ohio if he makes the ballot as an independent, then both Clinton and Trump are below 40%.
Yeah, and a couple things about that. First of all, I'm in the predictions business, and I've certainly messed up Trump and God knows what else. But I have a fairly safe prediction for this election, and that is that the Libertarian Party will have their best presidential election either. Why? Because their best performance was 1.1%. So, you know,
kind of a low bar, I
with
guess.
two very unpopular presidential candidates, I would think that Gary Johnson and his running mate William Weld will probably at least do over 1% in this election. The other thing is that, again, particularly in an election, I think when you have two candidates who have pretty bad unfavorables with like Clinton and Trump, is that I think voters, when if they talk to a pollster, they'd love to have some other option. And historically speaking, third-party candidates generally poll a little bit better than they perform. So just because Stein and Johnson are, what did you say, 7 and 4?
7 and 8.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I would not expect them to ultimately get that because voters ultimately are pretty partisan in this era, and they don't want to feel like the old cliche, like don't throw your vote away. But a lot of people believe that, and so they'll end up saying, oh God, I don't want Hillary Clinton to be president. Fine, I'll vote for Trump, and vice versa. So I guess I'd be surprised. Maybe Johnson could get 6 or 7, but Stein, that's probably a little high for her. So we'll see.
Now, data from the March 15th primary showed 3 times as many Democrats switching parties as Republicans did. Now, of course, John Kasich was still in the race then, so that may or may not, we know the data, we don't necessarily know the reasons why. There was more party switching, though, this year than there was in 2012. Does this mean that Trump will do well in Democratic areas of Ohio?
So in Ohio, unlike other states where it's kind of hard to vote to cross over in a primary, in Ohio you just have to ask for the ballot and you get it. And so I think that voters will sometimes go where the action is. And certainly the action, I think at that time of the primary was more on the Republican side, so I think there was more interest. But I think there may have also been a number of people who are maybe call themselves a Democrat, particularly in Southeast Ohio, but maybe they vote Republican for president. We've heard the term the old Reagan Democrats. A lot of those people are sort of Democrats in name only. And maybe Trump being out there caused them to vote in a primary that maybe they wouldn't have thought to vote in before. But there's also the possibility that Trump really is flipping some real Democrats to him. But here's the dynamic to watch, I think, in Ohio is that so Trump did great in Appalachian Ohio, so all along the Ohio River, in fact, all the way up to Ashtabula County, all the way to the outskirts of Cincinnati, the whole eastern southern border. But he really didn't do that well outside of that region. And Trump has shown strength in Appalachia, in Appalachian regions across the country. But he may have some special kind of working class appeal in places that maybe feel like they've been left behind by free trade, maybe aren't doing all that well economically.
He does well in counties that have higher unemployment rates.
But the flip side of that is that some of the most important counties in Ohio for any Republican are what I call the collar counties. Like Fairfield and Licking and Delaware around Franklin County, and Claremont, Butler, and Warren around Cincinnati. And let me use Delaware County as an example. Delaware County has the longest streak of voting Republican of any county in Ohio. It goes back to 1920. It is the wealthiest county in Ohio. I don't know the education level. I'm sure it's pretty high, though. And it was also Trump's worst county in the primary. And this is a county that is solidly Republican, but and it's also the fastest growing county in Ohio. So if, let's say, Trump does 5 points better than Romney did in Appalachia, well, what if he does 5 points worse than Romney in a place like Delaware County? Doesn't that all kind of just cancel itself out? And ultimately, Romney did lose the state by about 3 points. So if you're kind of just spinning your wheels, getting maybe a different block of votes from one place, but maybe losing in others, I don't know if that really does all that much for you. So that's what you need to watch, I think, is not just how's Trump doing in Appalachia, but how's Trump doing in the suburbs in Ohio? How's he doing in Delaware County or places like Medina in northeast Ohio that are growing, wealthy, and really probably isn't really Trump's target audience. So.
And I've heard it said that Central Ohio is going to be a big deal in this election because there's this perception that Cleveland and Cincinnati cancel each other out. Yep. That's not necessarily true. There are a lot more votes in Cleveland than there are in Cincinnati, and Central Ohio is going to be a big player.
Yeah, I do think that's right, and it may be that there are more ads run in the Columbus media market than any media market in the country. It's going to be Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, some counties in Florida and Virginia, but these elections are great for television networks because they make a lot of money in the swing states. to the point where a lot of the local TV affiliates in swing states are really hot properties, and when they go on the market, they say, hey, by the way, we're in Ohio, and we're going to get this huge influx of cash. I don't know if anyone else gets any benefit from this, from the bellwether status, but I know that the TV stations do. So yeah, Central Ohio is really important, and really the only Democratic county in Central Ohio is Franklin. But of course, Franklin is at any point, it may have already happened, Franklin is going to pass Cuyahoga as the most populous county in Ohio. Columbus has long had way more people than Cleveland, and you know the margins matter here. I mean, Franklin County could very well go 60-40 or better for Clinton, which it did for Obama in 2012. And then you have to look at what's Trump's margins in some of these suburban counties. Is it 60-40, like a Romney would do, or is it 55-45? If it's 55-45, I don't think Trump can win the state.
So Central Ohio is the key for either Clinton or Trump to really build a coalition.
I think Franklin County and Central Ohio is really important. You know, there used to be this, maybe some of you in the room have heard this sort of rule of thumb about Ohio elections about, oh, well, it's determined by how many votes does the Democrat net out of Cuyahoga County? And some people said, oh, it's 100,000. Well, Franklin Roosevelt got less than or more than 100,000 in 1944, but he didn't win the state. Or John Kerry got 224,000 margin out of Cuyahoga County in 2004, but he lost the state. And I think the thinking there is that that's not a great way of looking at the state, particularly because Cuyahoga and Franklin are now kind of equals, and Cuyahoga is still more Democratic, but the Democrats really need to get a ton of votes out of Franklin, a ton of votes out of Cuyahoga and some of the other northeastern counties. And then also in my home of my alma mater, the People's Republic of Athens, that little blue spot that you'll see on the election map on election night.
Interesting, though, Trump actually beat Kasich there in Athens County.
That's in dispute. Actually, no,
in the primary.
Well,
now, this is among just Republicans.
It was, I think, actually, in all seriousness, I think some sources say one thing and some say the other, but it was super close. And a lot of those counties, like Washington County, was pretty close. But yeah, for again, outside of Athens, Southeast Ohio has become pretty Republican, when a lot of those counties used to be somewhat Democratic.
Well, in a few minutes, we're going to move on to audience questions. So if you have questions, you might want to make your way to the microphone and think of them. But as we wait for that to happen, I have one more question for you. You write in your book that one of the other things about Ohio is that we have issueless politics. Well, I want to ask you, though, there have been plenty of times when ballot issues have been on the ballot during presidential years, and the question has always been, would the ballot issue affect the presidential race? What's the role the ballot issues play? So
let me just address the issueless politics thing quickly. So I don't think Ohio has kind of like a dominant statewide political ideology. I think it kind of just, if the Democrats have a good year, Democrats get elected. And the same thing is true Republicans. There's not a kind of an animating ideological force in Ohio politics, and that term issueless politics comes from this political scientist named John Fenton, who wrote this book about Midwest politics in the 1960s, and it was sort of an interesting way of looking at the state. But so ballot issues, there's actually a good recent example of how it may or may not have mattered, and that was the same-sex marriage amendment in 2004. And academic studies kind of differ as to how important that was in driving turnout for George W. Bush. I tend to think that Bush probably would have won the state without it. Others disagree with that. But I think if there is an effect from these ballot issues, it's probably somewhat muted. Because I think ultimately, particularly in presidential elections, people are coming out for the top of the ticket. And Americans are so focused on presidential elections and so not focused, unfortunately, on the other stuff down the ballot, that, again, I think that's what's driving things. And we see that in the turnout. Turnout's 60% typically in a presidential and more like 35 or 40 in a midterm.
So taking these issues that are very important to each political party and turning them into ballot issues doesn't necessarily drive turnout.
I don't think so, based on my reading of it. But again, let's say it helps by 1% or 2%. In a state like Ohio, that could be decisive. And again, I don't necessarily think that the same-sex marriage amendment delivered Ohio to Bush in 2004. But again, others, there are other people who believe that it did, particularly Democrats who saw that as a big deal and as somewhat decisive in that election. But the thing about 2004 is that, so, I looked through these 30 elections and found that Ohio, votes very close to the national average. Well, Ohio voted almost precisely the same as the nation in 2004, and so there was nothing odd about those results. And there are these wild conspiracy theories about how that Secretary of State Ken Blackwell and the Republican campaign stole Ohio somehow. They rigged the voting machines or whatever. But again, there's just not a lot of good evidence of that. And it shows up in the election results, which Ohio voted exactly the way you would think it would vote in an election like that.
Well, it is Columbus Metropolitan Club's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name, ask your question. We thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. So let's proceed with the first question, and that caveat there to Gene Krebs.
Yes. Hi, Gene Krebs. So as a professional pundit, in your case, let's go out on a limb. 10 years from now, what do the constituencies look like for both of the major political parties? Or will we still have them in a recognizable shape in 10 years?
That's a pretty simple question. No, it's a good question, though, and something that's worth thinking about. So, the growth in the United States, and even in Ohio, although not at as big as numbers as nationally, is growth of non-white voters. We're going to be a majority-minority nation somewhere in the middle of this century. And I think the electorate will reflect that too. 30% of all voters, roughly, in this next election are going to be non-white. That's going to be the highest number, the highest number ever, according to exit polls. And I really think that if we continue to see sort of an equilibrium between the two parties, if both parties have the ability to win, which I think is true in this election and is true generally, what would have to happen then is either Republicans would have to start doing better with minorities. Minorities went 80-20 for Obama in 2012. Or they'd have to do better amongst whites. And Romney already won 60-40 amongst whites in 2012. So, the likelier thing to me is that the Republicans start doing better amongst whites. The Democrats continue to do well amongst the growing non-white portion of the electorate. And then you have an electorate that becomes more and more polarized by race, which to me is kind of a grim outcome because, obviously the United States still has a lot of racial problems. We've just seen a lot of it recently with the police shootings and these other things. And I think it would be healthier for the country is if both parties had kind of multiracial coalitions, but that's not what the trends tell us. I think the trends tell us that the country's going to continue to get more polarized by race. And again, that's, whether it's good or bad or whatever, that's what I would suggest.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Beth Irvin, and I'm with Experience Columbus. In Columbus, recent bids to host the Republican and the Democratic National Conventions, we billed ourselves as the swing city and the swing state. Any validity to that claim? And I have one more question I want to slip in before I sit down.
Sure.
Do you think there will be any impact on the Republican National Convention being held in Cleveland on the vote?
So there is not any historical evidence that holding a convention in a certain state has an electoral impact. In fact, even if there were, let's say if John Kasich were selected as Trump's running mate, which doesn't look likely, but who knows, Kasich would probably be worth about a point or two in Ohio, given that he's a popular governor, and maybe that would be the difference in the state. One of the two times of the last 30 elections that Ohio did not vote for the winner was 1944. Franklin Roosevelt lost the state by 0.4 of a percentage point, and to Thomas Dewey, and Dewey's running mate was John Bricker, who was governor of Ohio. So I think that's definitely an instance where the running mate, swung the election. But so very minor impact for running mates, and I would say no impact at all for the convention in terms of it swinging the state or even the local area where it's held. As for Columbus as the swing city and the swing state, Columbus and Franklin are not swing areas anymore. They're Democratic areas, at least in presidential elections, and increasingly it's that way, I would say, down the ballot. However, if you take central Ohio as a whole, it is a swing region because it's basically Franklin County versus everyone else. And this is, Franklin is growing. A lot of the collar counties around Franklin are growing. And I would think just generally the center of gravity in the state of Ohio has probably been sort of like moving south over time to the point where, because Northeast Ohio isn't really growing as much and Columbus is, that I think Columbus and Central Ohio sort of becomes sort of more important over time because of the population trends. And it's important to note that Ohio's population is actually growing. It's just not growing at a fast rate. So a lot of other states are growing faster. That's why we're losing electoral votes. Now, some places in Ohio are flat out losing population. Cuyahoga County is one, Hamilton County is another, Franklin County is not, and a lot of the suburban counties around the big cities are growing at a pretty quick rate.
Jason Como with Mount Carmel Health System. Let me start with a brief editorial comment. As a fellow Scripps alum, let's go Bobcats.
I was just recounting to someone the other day. They asked me about the Bobcats, and I said our proudest moment was that little scuffle with Brutus. We lost the game like 50-0, but he got his pops in. I'm
definitely stealing the People's Republic of Athens.
That's
joke.
right.
I'm definitely stealing that. I'll give credit. So my question is, just about from either side would say that this year's presidential campaign, at least during the primaries and as it looks thus far, has been, let's call it unconventional. I'm sure history is littered with perhaps not similar, but other unconventional type candidates, campaigns, and the like. If you could prognosticate on how that looks, if that will change anything from data to research to outcome based on the fact that it's been a little different this year.
So one of the reasons why people like myself did not think that Trump would win the nomination, was wrong about that, was that Trump did not fit the profile of a traditional nominee. He did not have support from party leadership, which is typically an important thing to have. He did not have a formal fundraising apparatus. He wasn't really running a ton of television ads and that sort of thing. He wasn't doing a lot of the so-called ground game, with political professionals, knocking on doors, doing digital advertising, that sort of thing. But Trump was able to run his campaign through Twitter and through the media. One study said that he basically got $2 billion worth of effectively free advertising by being on television all the time. So he was on all the Sunday morning talk shows on the big networks. He was on cable all the time, and cable, frankly, bent their own rules to put him on. They let him call in via cell phone, which typically people aren't allowed to do. So who knows if when he was on the phone, somebody was slipping him notes or something. And look, I don't blame him for doing it. If he asked for it and they give it to him, why would he stop? But I don't know if a future candidate could do that because Trump is already a 100% name ID basically when he entered the race. He's unlike a lot of recent politicians. There are some. Wendell Willkie is a person. He was the 1940 Republican nominee. He was a business guy who had never served before. Some have compared him to Trump to Willkie. I actually compare Trump to George Wallace, who ran unsuccessfully a few times for the Democratic presidential nomination, the former segregationist governor of Alabama. Wallace ran as an independent in 1968, got about 13% of the vote, got about the same in Ohio. And Wallace was, frankly, he was a candidate of white resentment. And I do think that there is some of that in Trump's campaign, just to be totally blunt about it. Now, the other things are interesting about Trump's campaign in that he's different from other Republicans in that he's not a hawk on foreign policy, like not at all. In fact, I'd say Hillary Clinton is probably has the more aggressive foreign policy. And in fact, some people, who were neoconservative in the Bush era, who were for the Iraq War, have actually endorsed Clinton in this race. But what's interesting to me is whether Trump wins or loses, does the Republican Party look different after him? Which I know isn't precisely your question, but it kind of gets at the other question we had about what the future of the parties look like. And maybe the Republicans won't be the hawkish foreign policy party anymore. or maybe they won't be the pro-free trade party anymore. You know, they'll take on some of these Trumpish aspects and adopt it into their future politics, or Trump may just be a drop in the bucket, and then things go back to the way they were in 2020. Who knows? You know, again, the thing about Trump is I don't know if it's his campaign strategy. I don't know if it's replicable for candidates who aren't as well known and aren't as, you know, outlandish and good on TV, you know, as he is.
Ken Thompson, architect. My first time ever we've had a woman running for president. I keep on thinking, like, when's she going to bring one of her grandchildren out and play with them? It's just to play off that side angle, and maybe that's all wrong, but how do you think it'll have an impact, having a woman on the ticket, leading the ticket?
It's amazing how small of a story that is. And I don't know, it might be because Clinton is such a well-known person and people have such preconceived notions about her. You know, she's done a lot of damage to herself throughout this campaign. I think that's indisputable. She's made some self-inflicted errors with this email thing and all the Clinton Foundation acted and all that. But there's no evidence that female candidates pay penalty in general elections. Now, there are barriers to entry for women to enter politics. So it seems like it's harder to get qualified women to run, but once they do run, there's not any evidence that they do any worse than a male candidate would do. And maybe, you know, the fact that we now have a female presidential nominee, maybe it sort of opens up doors for other people. But, you know, a female representation in the House and Senate is, you know, higher than it's ever been, but I think there's about 85 women in the U.S. House out of 435 and 20 senators out of 100. And certainly minorities are you know, non-white people are represented at much lower rates than they are as a percentage of the population. So on one hand, we've come a long way. On the other hand, there's a long way to go, I think, on that. You know, again, the other thing is that while we have a lot of examples of women running for governor or for Senate or for House or what have you, this is uncharted territory for us in having a woman running for president. And so we can't be precisely sure, I guess, if there is some sort of benefit she may have because of that, or if there's some sort of downside that she experiences because of that.
Interesting. Jane Scott, Metropolitan Club. Thank you for being here, both of you. You've already answered some of this, but just expound on it a little bit. Obviously, even people like John Kasich and the other candidates cried foul with the media, giving Donald Trump so much attention and so much play. How has that changed how media are going to look at elections from now on, and how much influence they're going to have? And the second part of that is kind of a media question, too. What are the headlines next weekend and the weekend during the Cleveland Convention? What kind of things are we going to see as the highlights as the headlines?
Let me take the second question first. There's actually some indication that the polls are kind of tightening up a little bit, and so long as Trump has, you know, just below average convention, I think it's possible that Trump would take the lead nationally right after the RNC, because that's what happens. There's a bump after the convention. Now, Clinton would probably get her own bump in Philadelphia the week following, but the headline may very well be that Trump actually is gaining a little bit. Now, historically speaking, the polls become a lot more predictive after the conventions. So let's look at where things are in maybe the second week of August. Not to say that that's going to be ironclad at that point, but you know, if things settle into where they are now, which is Clinton generally up about 4 or 5 points nationally, probably a good indication that she's going to win. But it's also possible that Trump does in fact start, you know, gain as I think he has kind of gained over the last week. And as for the other media question, I think that it kind of goes back to my previous answer about is Trump kind of this one-time phenomenon, and he got a lot of coverage basically because because he generated ratings or because the networks wanted to have him on. I mean, you know, the media, the amount of time on television would have been a lot different if not for Trump. Probably a little more balanced, although. You know, Jeb Bush, remember him? You know, he ran a ton of television advertising in late 2015, early 2016. It did not move the needle at all for him. So, and again, Trump didn't run very much, himself, and ended up doing quite well. And so maybe if he had only gotten $1 billion worth of free TV and not $2 billion, maybe he still would have won. In fact, I think he probably would have. Because he just had, a message that worked for this particular election, and he benefited from a very crowded field.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
Thank you. Kathy Fox, I'm with the Pizzuti Companies. This is the first time I can remember two major party candidates for president that have such high negatives, and there are so many people who, no matter what their party affiliation, are saying, well, I'm not going to vote for my party's nominee. At the end of the day, do you think that will make a difference in the outcome?
So historically, you basically need like 90% plus of your own self-identified partisans to support you. So I think it's still a question as to whether Clinton and Trump can get 90% of their own party. I ultimately think Trump probably has the bigger party unity question, but we'll have to see about that. But in these polls, you'll see generally there's like 35 to 40% say they're a self-identified Democrat, maybe 35% self-identified Republican, and then maybe 35% who call themselves independents. A lot of those people who call themselves independents are lying. They, realistically, the electorate is about 45% of people are, lean Democratic or Democratic. They may call themselves an independent, roughly similar share of the Republicans. And so there's not a whole lot of true independents. And the people who are the true independents are the ones who basically don't pay a lot of attention. And so they may be the people who just decide not to vote, or they decide in the last, late. But this election is a test of party unity, I think. Again, because we have two candidates who are kind of unpopular, but I would suspect that the vast majority of the voters will come home by the end.
We do have time for more questions because we started a little late, so
okay.
go right ahead.
Yes, my name is John McKnight. I work at Rife's Auto Body here in Columbus. So presumably, Kyle, you studied a lot of polls. Is there a go-to poll, one that you rely on, a reliable poll that can really be counted on? And if not, should we be paying any attention to the polls at all?
What I use is polling averages, and Real Clear Politics has one, and Huffington Post Pollster has another. And so, if you don't like the Quinnipiac poll, like wait around, and you'll probably get another one that says something different. And I think there should be some variation in polling. I mean, you shouldn't expect to get the same numbers every time because there's variation in the numbers. But if you just throw them all into the same pot in a polling average, then you get a sense as to what all the polls are saying. And those polling averages, they're not perfect, but they're generally pretty accurate on election day. So that's what I'd recommend. So it's not one particular poll, but it's groups of polls. And as for the national polling, Pew Research Institute or Pew Research Center is the best. They do incredible work, and that's the one national poll I like. But again, if you're looking at national polls, you can put those in the average too.
But we don't have really a whole lot of polling going on in Ohio, and a lot of states don't.
Quinnipiac has been doing a poll basically every month, and again, there's probably going to be one coming out later today or tomorrow. But yeah, generally not. So we don't have a lot of state-level polling, and part of it is that good polling is expensive, and a lot of times news organizations have to sponsor it. And news organizations may not have the money or the interest, particularly this far out from the election. So we're kind of just sort of looking for scraps. And in 2012, the best polls were the ones conducted by the Obama campaign. Like I think we know that after the campaign that we heard about their internal polls and they're basically spot on. So a lot of the public stuff you get is not great.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sophie Smith-Campbell, and I'm a high school student, and my question is, with the trend of kids like my age leaning towards more radical people like Bernie Sanders, what do you see happening in 2020 when we can vote?
I'm glad you used the R word, so I didn't have to. But I do think that we have seen a trend in American politics where basically Democrats are getting more liberal and Republicans are getting probably more conservative than Democrats are getting liberal or becoming liberal. But it's happening on both sides. And I kind of wonder if Sanders is sort of if Clinton won the primary this time, but maybe the next Democratic nominee will look something more like Sanders, which I think is kind of reasonable to suspect. However, I think we look at, Bernie Sanders got somewhere in the low 40s in terms of the total primary vote across the country. And I think it's natural to think, oh, well, that's a big 40+% block of voters who are really liberal. And a lot of them are, but some of them aren't. Like, Sanders did really well in states like West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma that still have a lot of conservative Democrats who vote in Democratic primaries. And for those voters, Sanders was kind of a protest vote. So at least some little piece of the Sanders electorate is not liberal at all, really. It's just that they don't like Obama and they didn't like Clinton, so they're like, oh, well, we'll vote for the protest candidate. And that shows up in exit polls. In like Oklahoma, they said, are you a conservative Democrat? And 15, 20% of the voters were in Oklahoma, and Sanders won that group like 55 to 20 or something like that. So Sanders may very well represent the future, but perhaps not. And his voting bloc is very liberal and pretty progressive and arguably radical, but not the whole thing.
Go ahead.
I'm Martha Trout. Is there any chance at these two upcoming conventions that the presumed candidates will not be picked?
There has been some rumblings about that on the Republican side, but think about this. For months and months and months, we heard about the so-called Republican establishment was going to step in and they were going to stop Trump. They stopped him in Wisconsin, and they were going to stop him in Indiana, which they didn't. If the so-called establishment has been getting beat consistently, why would you expect them to win at the last, most crucial moment when the odds are the longest? So on the Republican side, there is a majority of delegates at the convention who are bound, in some states by law, although there's some legal question about whether that can happen or not, but they're bound to vote for Trump. And those people in their heart of hearts may not actually like Trump, but the law says, and the rules of the Republican Party say that they have to vote for him. It is hypothetically possible that the Republicans could vote to unbind all of their delegates. And that's what Ted Kennedy wanted to do at the Democratic Convention in 1980 when he lost to Carter, is he advocated before the convention, unbind the delegates, they want me. That didn't happen because ultimately, I just can't imagine the Republicans going against the public's will in nominating Trump. And for 40 years, it used to be that the nominees were chosen essentially kind of in smoke-filled rooms and by the delegates. The people pick, the voters of the Republican and Democratic parties pick. And it's just so hard for me to imagine them going against the people at this late stage. For the Democrats, I think the big question was, and maybe one of the reasons why Bernie Sanders stayed in was that he may have thought that she was going to get indicted over the emails. And that was a big open question. It's now resolved, at least for now. And so that would have been the one way in which it's possible that Sanders could have gotten nominated, or even Joe Biden could have been airlifted in to save the party. But I don't see that now. It would have to be, for Clinton, it would have to be some sort of like new legal issue. And it would have to be a legal issue that would be so bad that it would force her from the campaign. Is it for certain that she would have quit if she had been indicted? I don't know. I mean, probably, but it's hard to say. So I feel pretty certain that Clinton and Trump will be the nominees, despite the fact that there are some holdouts, I guess, in both parties.
The good news is we will know at least probably by Friday morning, maybe Friday afternoon, if the Republicans are going to make that choice, because the Rules Committee meets tomorrow. So we'll at least have an answer on that one.
Yeah.
So, all right, Kyle, thank you very much. Thank you for all your questions. Thanks for being here.
Great stuff. Thank you. Very informative, very interesting. And we hope you enjoyed the forum. We encourage you to continue the conversation outside these doors. The incentive is coffee and cookies. You can view and share today's forum and all the other forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU, and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. And again, our sponsors, Hannah News Service and the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, our speakers, Kyle Kondik and Karen Kassler. A reminder that Kyle's book is available, and he will be signing it afterwards, so please stop by and say hello, at the least. And thanks to all of you for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at the CMC event soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Karen?
I'll see you.
Yeah.
Take your time.
Okay.
I'll see you when you
Yeah.
get there.